Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to colleagues from Britain, Ireland, and as far away I understand as Canada and the United States. So you're all very, very welcome to this rather hot British day, which is unusual. I'm a member of the RCN History of Nursing Forum Committee and have been for a number of years. It's really exciting that we're now doing these events online, so many people from around the world can join us. I'm really pleased to introduce this event, which is part of a series linked to the RCN Library and Archives exhibition on the history of nursing. The current exhibition looks at nursing, myths and stereotypes from Florence Nightingale onwards. The History of Nursing Forum has worked closely with the library and has done for many years, and Archive Service on this event and the series and the exhibition, so it's great to be working with them. If you're an RCN member and you're not a member of the History of Nursing Forum, please do join, and the link will be pasted in the chat later. Today we're exploring the current nursing role in the 1918 flu pandemic and what lessons we can learn for COVID-19. And it really is a great pleasure for me to hand over to Professor Christine Hallett of the University of Huddersfield, Amanda Gwinnup, and Olivia Gordon. I've known Christine many, many years, probably far more than we would like to think. And it's always wonderful to have her talk because she is really so knowledgeable and can tell us so much. So I hand over to our three speakers and enjoy.
Hi, everybody. I must apologise for the fact that I think my internet is a little bit unstable. So it may be that my sound will drop in and out, but I'm sure that Sarah Cheney will let me know if that happens. Okay, welcome everybody. I do hope that you continue to be able to hear me okay and to see the slides. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Royal College of Nursing for organising this series of events. We're really pleased to be able to talk about this piece of work. It's very much a work in progress. As you can imagine, we only just started working on it a few months ago. This problem, COVID-19, only started for us this year. And the University of Huddersfield was very quick to offer some funding for its staff to work on various aspects of COVID-19 and the implications of COVID-19. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to offer you an insight into the earliest findings of our study funded by the University of Huddersfield. And I'll begin by introducing our project team. My name's Christine Hallett, and I'm the lead academic on this project. And you'll be hearing from me at the beginning and at the end of the presentation. Then I'll be passing you on to my colleague, Olivia Gordon. Olivia's research explores the work of nurses during the H1N1 Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919. She's been doing a lot of work on this subject for the last several months and is becoming an expert on nursing and Spanish flu. And then after you've heard from Liv, you will then hear from Amanda Gwinnup, whose work focuses on the ways in which early 20th century nurses experienced trauma, ranging from physical illness to psychological conditions, which at that time in the early 20th century were variously labeled shell shock, neurasthenia, and hysteria. And she's looking at how these illnesses resulted from nurses' work and nurses' exposure to trauma during the First World War. And she's including in her research their experiences of work with the influenza pandemic that accompanied the war's last few months, and then of course extended beyond those months. So we're exploring the ways in which the burden of a rapidly emerging crisis can fall on people, in this instance nurses, who are working on a designated front line. Our work employs historical methodology to reflect on the resonances between the experiences of today's nurses and of those who cared for patients during the H1N1 so-called Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 19. So the focus of our research is on the dual roles that nurses took on as both individuals who performed intensive work in order to preserve life but also as emblems of resilience for a weakened society. We acknowledge that those who were caring for patients during the Spanish flu pandemic were also part of the front line of a global war, and that this heightened and intensified the pressures they were under. The context of their work was very different from that of today's nurses, but there were also some remarkable similarities. And we refer to those similarities as resonances. We fully recognise the dangers of too easily attempting to translate the so-called lessons of the past into learning experiences for today, but we also think that you will find these resonances of the past interesting and illuminating. So what we're arguing is that over 100 years ago, during the Spanish influenza pandemic, nurses were performing these two highly significant roles. Alongside their complex clinical work, preserving the lives of individual influenza patients, they were also acting as a calming influence on the entire population. And we argue that this calm, cool, and courageous image presented by the early 20th century nurse belied the pressure that she was under. And I say she because those professional nurses of the early 20th century were all women at that time. Many nurses became severely traumatised as a result of their experiences. And our study examines not only the mirage of safety and control presented by nurses, but also the toll this collective mask of resilience took upon the human beings behind it. We further argue that there are powerful resonances between the work and experience of nurses during that influenza pandemic and the current COVID-19 pandemic. And working on this project whilst the current pandemic was raging compelled us to ask a further supplementary question, which is, are societies condemned to repeat the errors of the past? And if so, does it then become the role of so-called frontline carers to carry the burden of those mistakes? So the preliminary findings of this project have been accepted for publication, we're really pleased to be able to say, in the research section of the journal, The Nursing Times. So we can let you know that these findings and arguments should be available in print fairly soon. So our study was designed to meet the following current needs. Firstly, the need to better understand what permits nurses to perform exhausting physical and emotional work in order to save the lives of individuals with an acute incurable infection, to remain calm, thus exerting a calming influence on the population as a whole, to present themselves as emblems of resilience, enabling a population to exhibit a more general resilience at a time of crisis. Secondly, the need to address the failure of governments and societies to offer adequate protection, recognition, and compensation to nurses who perform arduous and essential work, in particular to explore ways in which the nursing profession itself might work to make its contribution more visible in order to counter the production of too comfortable and simplistic images of nurses as frontline heroes. Not that we don't think they're frontline heroes, we just think that there's a lot more work to be done to support them than just calling them frontline heroes. And thirdly, they need to explore the ways in which the nursing profession might reflect on the 1918-19 influenza pandemic and its impact on nurses in order to recognise both the value of resilience, but also its so-called dark side. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Olivia Gordon, who will explore the background and methodology of our study.
Thank you. So the study focuses in part on the premise that the COVID-19 pandemic has significant resonances with the H1N1 pandemic. Infection rates and death tolls from the H1N1 rose in three distinct waves or surges from June 1918 through to the early summer of 1919. The exact science of the virus and its prevention came to light only slowly, and although there is a dispute over mortality rates, it is estimated to have killed between 2 and 5% of the world's population. The pandemic was unexpected and came as a shock to societies which had begun to believe that they were gaining mastery over epidemic diseases, and who had to acknowledge that their mastery over nature was still at a much lower level than they had believed. Little is known about the work of nurses during the H1N1 pandemic, or about the impact of that work on those nurses' own physical and mental health. Existing historical research focuses on their public health response in the USA, whilst most existing insights into the British response had been presented as part of wider studies of nursing work during the First World War, focusing primarily on combat-related injury and disease. What is known is that the doctors of the time expressed a sense of helplessness in the face of this incurable disease, regarding careful nursing as the patient's only chance of recovery, whilst nurses themselves went beyond the normal call of duty, working long hours and taking pride in saving lives. Can you put the next slide on, please, Chris? Thank you. It has often been found difficult to write about how Britain combated the 1918 Spanish flu, paradoxically because there is both too much and too little information. Many of the surviving written sources on the topic are either American or Canadian, with very little written from a British perspective. It has also been argued that there is a lack of secondary literature on the pandemic because it was simply not as memorable as the concurrent Great War. Tom Quinn has argued that the lives of the pandemic victims were cut short by an unseen, unknown enemy. There was nothing heroic about it at all. In most cases, death was messy and painful, but essentially private, and therefore those who were killed by the pandemic were not remembered like the soldiers who were killed in action, despite the numbers killed by flu being drastically higher. Jane Elizabeth Fisher has also argued that the influenza pandemic has been neglected by historians due to its awe-inspiring destructive power and the inability of human language to adequately represent mortality on such a large scale. This argument has also been supported by Alfred W. Crosby, one of the first historians to write about the 1918 pandemic in depth, as he believes that major writers of the generation were busy memorialising the experience of the Great War and therefore found little reason to write about the flu. There is also, therefore, a large gap in the history of the nurse during this challenging time. Many authors mention and recognise the ongoing work of nurses and other frontline medical staff, but very few go into detail about the role of the nurse, especially when faced with a new strain of disease that did not have a miracle cure. Historian Nancy Burstow emphasises the importance of nurses in her book American Pandemic, as she says that there wasn't much a doctor could do. She quotes a physician who said that the main reason for doctors visiting patients was to find out who was dead and then bury them, leaving the main source of care to come from the nurses. What little attention has been given to the nurses who cared for the influenza patients of 1918 to 19 indicates that, as argued by Pamela J. Wood, nurses proved their worth during the pandemic. She suggests that this was a significant point in the profession's history, in which nurses were able to demonstrate the importance of care when there is no cure. It was known that people's best chance of survival was to be utterly selfish, which was the complete opposite of what these nurses took upon themselves to do, endangering themselves in order to help care for others and provide an emblem of hope and resilience for those in need. In reflecting on the echoes between H1N1 and Covid-19, our study explored a range of archival, published and oral history sources to establish the nature of the early 20th century's nurses' work with the H1N1 patients and the significance of the trauma that they experienced as a result of this work. The research took place during a period of total and then partial lockdown in Britain, when it was impossible to travel to archives. Hence, the study team focused on primary source materials available online, or in some cases, as previously copied, material from the Royal College of Nursing Archives and the National Archives UK. These include nurses' personal writings, textbooks and articles in professional nursing journals, the Nursing Times, the Nursing Mirror and the British Journal of Nursing. We also examine newspapers via digital archives and images that illustrate the construction of the image of the resilient nurse in 1918 to 19. Among the most important sources for the study were a number of documentary materials available either online or as digital copies. The War Office files, the W0399 series, recently made available online by the National Archives, and the Ministry of Pension files, the PIN 26 series, which was already available to us as material photographed for personal use by my colleague Amanda Gwinnup. We're examining 320 pension files held at the National Archives for information about the experience of nurses whose health broke down as a result of their war service. and then deliberately selecting a small number of case studies from those whose health was said to have been damaged by the stress and strain of their work. Now I'll hand you over to my colleague Amanda Gwinnup, who will talk about some of the findings of her research on these files.
Thanks, Liv. Our study, which is, like Chris said, soon to be published in the Nursing Times, identified 5 distinct resonances between the experiences of nurses during the H1N1 pandemic and the current COVID-19 pandemic. The work during the 1918-1919 H1N1 pandemic was physically and emotionally demanding. Stress and strain of service, which was cited as the cause of many pensional disabilities by the Ministry of Pensions. Many frontline nurses then and now have to live away from loved ones, forcing many to feel deployed in place as though they are nursing during a time of war. Donning one's PPE at the start of a shift could be compared to the battle dress of soldiers and could be psychologically triggering. Today's nurses have been propagandized, just like the nurses of the Spanish flu. The work of nurses in all settings, both civilian and military, during the 1918-19 pandemic was physically and emotionally intensive, involving constant attention to patients' breathing, positioning, nutritional and hydration status, and mental and emotional morale. In 2020, attention must be paid to essentially the same life-saving imperatives, but the measures taken are now mediated through new and demanding technologies. First-hand accounts of nurses on the front line in 1918-19 show the determination of nurses to help their patients despite the high risks. My colleague, Olivia Gordon, whom you have just heard from, examined the Royal College of Nursing's transcript of an oral history interview with Elizabeth Cockayne, a fever nurse during the pandemic. She was asked if she noticed any difference between general and fever nursing, and her response was as follows: "No, I don't think that I did. I think I was always wanting to give. I was always wanting to nurse and to do what I thought was helpful to them, no matter what." Stress and strain of service, as seen here on this on the medical board sheet. This is a phrase frequently used in the Ministry of Pensions files for nurses demobilized in 1919, and bears resonance for the experience of today's nurses, as not all trauma is physically inflicted. Fear, worry, and exhaustion can cause trauma. One of the findings of our work to date is that a range of physical illnesses were caused by, but not necessarily attributed to, the active service in 1918 and 19. Many nurses, for example, experienced painful kidney infections that left lifelong damage as a result of not being able to void their bladders when needed. Not being able to focus on their own physical needs was a hidden cause of trauma, and a similar failure to attend to their own needs appears to be affecting today's nurses. The stress of caring for influenza patients went well beyond the normal stress of the job. Cockayne acknowledged that in 1918-19, many nurses were openly afraid of contracting influenza in the course of their work. And to make the situation worse, there was uncertainty about when the pandemic would end. The same fears and uncertainties are experienced by today's frontline nurses. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. The nurses on active service in 1918-19 were obliged to live away from home, often for many months at a time. Many of today's nurses and carers have chosen to live away from their families and friends as a precaution, and it may feel as though they are deployed in place. The act of putting on protective medical clothing can be traumatizing in itself, an act that preludes the day's hard work and its attendant emotional and physical stresses. It highlights the risk and is symbolically akin to the battle dress of a soldier or a medic. This, along with the government and media hype about frontline workers and the use of military tropes, may heighten the stress. At the beginning of the 1918-19 pandemic, war nurses already had a long history of being used as propaganda to support public morale. Images of nurses as angels and heroines appeared in numerous newspaper articles and other sources. Similarly, in the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a focus on the frontline nature of nursing work, its dangers and its sacrifices nurses and other healthcare workers are making. This can create additional stress and pressures for the frontline carers, even as it offers comfort to the rest of the population. Next slide, please. Thank you. As Olivia stated just a few moments ago, the H1N1 pandemic of 1918-19 overlapped with the final year of the First World War, and therefore it is almost impossible to separate the psychological effects of the pandemic, that the pandemic had on British nurses from the psychological impact of the war. Therefore, the case studies on our project are nurses whose military service overlapped with the war and the pandemic. Among our case studies were nursing sisters Lillian Atkins, Isma Brown, Edith Burge, Margaret Hollow, Florence Cattle, and Mary Cleaverly. All were experienced, professionally trained nurses who joined the nursing services in 1914 or 1915. All 6 served until 1919 and continued to work as nurses following their demobilization with varying degrees of success. Nurses Brown and Cleaverly both suffered breakdowns at their places of work in 1920, and both were institutionalized at different times during 1920 and 1921. 5 of these women received war disability pensions from the Ministry of Pensions, but one was denied on the grounds that she had allowed too much time to elapse before applying in 1929. One nurse was able to continue in her profession for a significant length of time. Sister Burge worked as a part-time night nurse after relocating to Canada. The nurses were pensioned for neurasthenia, psychoneurosis, debility, and/or exhaustion psychosis. Common symptoms shared by the women included severe headaches, insomnia and depression, while nightmares, tremors in the limbs, and hysterical paralysis affected a few. Stress and strain of service was cited as the cause of all of these nurses' psychological wounds. I will now focus on one of the nurses from our study, Sister Cattle. Florence Annie Cattle, born in 1882 from Stratford-upon-Avon, joined the Territorial Force Nursing Service on the 7th of August, 1914, just 4 days after war was declared on Germany. She served at home from that date until June 1915, when she went abroad, serving on a hospital ship in the Mediterranean and then on land in Egypt until October of 1916. Prior to her deployment overseas, she was declared to be in a normal state of health and fit for duty abroad by the Royal Army Medical Corps. Sister Cattle's medical problems began while serving in Egypt. Unfortunately, there is a gap in her medical and service records from 1916 to 1917. Therefore, the origins of her disability have been pieced together based on statements made after her service, in which it was explained that she suffered from dysentery and possibly from the heat while in Egypt. While on home, she met her family doctor, Dr. Hewer. A medical statement provided by Dr. Hewer on the 16th of January, 1917, stated that he had examined Sister Cattle and considered that she was, quote, suffering from acute neurasthenia and should have 2 months complete rest. This is the earliest diagnosis of the disability that Sister Cattle would eventually be awarded a pension for. A letter written by her father, Isaiah, informing his daughter's command that she was unable to return to work at present through illness, was sent 2 days later. She was medically boarded at the Military Hospital Warwick on the 31st of January, 1917, where her disability was officially declared to be neurasthenia. The board wrote, "She is in a weak, nervous condition. She takes her nourishment fairly. She sleeps well, but with the help of bromides. She suffers occasionally from headaches. She is shaky and totters when she walks." To the question, was the disability contracted under circumstances over which she had no control? The board affirmed yes, meaning they determined that her neurasthenia was caused directly by her military service and cited stress and strain of service as the direct cause. The medical board 9 months later, on the 3rd of September 1917, declared that she was fit for general service, meaning she was no longer restricted to light duty. However, a few days later, the matron of the 2nd Northern General Hospital, where Nurse Cattle was working, matron Miss E.S. Innes, wrote to the matron-in-chief, Sidney Brown, "Sister Cattle is really quite unfit for duty, as she is very unbalanced, and in consequence, the men in her ward are under no control. She is on duty at Killingbeck, as it was thought it would be easier for her there. We really think it would be wiser for her to be boarded out of service. I know the officer under whom she works would endorse this opinion. It is impossible to determine if anything came of Miss Inn's concerns, as there is nothing in her War Office record or pension records that indicate that any action was taken. The medical board on the 4th of March in 1918, which was her next one, declared her fit for general duty, although stated that they believed that she would not be able to take the stress of foreign service. It was not until a medical board on the 4th of March 1918 that Alexandria, Egypt was provided as the disability's place of origin. Through other medical boards and letters, it has been determined that Sister Cattle succumbed to sunstroke and dysentery while serving in Egypt. She explained to a medical board in 1950 that her insomnia was caused by being cut off from morphia very abruptly in 1916. Although there are numerous medical boards and multiple letters from Sister Cattle and her associates in the pension file, which spans 5 decades, this was the only mention of morphia being used to treat her condition. Sister Cattle demobilized in May of 1919 and transitioned directly into a pension, and then applied directly to the Ministry of Pensions in 1920, once that became available to war nurses. On exiting the TFNS, Sister Cattle returned to her permanent home of record in Stratford-on-Avon to live with her father. And on the 20th of March, 1920, the Ministry of Pensions sent Sister Cattle an award renewal form, which she promptly filled out and returned by post. The resulting medical board, which was her first experience with the ministry's doctors and board officials, took place on the 23rd of April, 1920 in Coventry. The board assessed her neurasthenia as mild and improving and set her award for 20%. Her symptoms are listed as on other medical boards and reports. Headaches at times, insomnia, and depression. On exertion, she still suffers from breathlessness, but feels much better than she was. This board also included a description of the nursing work Sister Cattle had completed after her service. She explained that she had worked at a local diphtheria hospital for 12 weeks at 12 hours a day, but, quote, at the end of this period, she felt rather spent, end quote. The board determined that she was physically fit and set the pension for 12 months. On the 6th of April, 1921, the ministry requested her address because she had not responded to their pension renewal request forms. She later explained what caused her pension to lapse. The chief reason I let my pension lapse in 1920 was an experience I had at a medical board in Coventry. The board forgot for the moment that a trained nurse sat in front of them and discussed the likelihood of my keeping on losing my reason. And not until the mischief was done did they realize I understood all their technical terms. That put me in a terrible state for weeks. I could not get it out of my mind. And I told Mr. Hewer about it and said nothing would make me risk that again. Mr. Hewer agreed and promised to help me should I wish to claim my pension again. For 7 years, Sister Cattle tried to earn a modest living. With the assistance of her father, she opened a small nursing home, but after 4 years, she had to convert it to a boarding house. In August of 1926, she had a breakdown, and in March of 1927, her father passed away. She was left in the care of her niece, a music teacher, but they were struggling financially as Sister Cattle was completely unable to work. During the months of October and November of 1928, the Stratford-upon-Avon branch of the British Legion took it upon themselves to gather testimonial letters in support of Sister Cattle's attempt to reapply for her disability pension. The organization gathered up 11 letters along with their own letter written by the branch's secretary, Mr. E. Foley, and sent them to the Ministry of Pensions. It is clear from the letters that Sister Cattle was struggling to get by. The letters also indicate that her health and well-being, owing to neurasthenia, had deteriorated significantly in the 7 years. The following is a letter from her family doctor, Mr. Hewer. I certified that I attended Sister Cattle in January 1917, when she came home from Egypt. She was then in a very nervous state, suffering from insomnia and depression. She was in bed for 6 weeks and at home for about 5 months. She then rejoined her unit at Leeds and worked until she was demobilized about June 1919. After helping with some work at the Fever Hospital, she opened a small nursing home in Stratford-on-Avon in 1920 and kept this going for 4.5 years. She, being in indifferent health most of the time due to her insomnia and depression, and ultimately had to give it up and tried to take in lodgers. But this culminated in a regular breakdown in August of 1926, since which time she has been unable to do anything. Her father died in March of 1927, and her health being what it is, she is now unable to support herself. During the whole of this period, I have attended Sister Cattle on and off, nearly always for insomnia and depression. She has never really gotten over since she came home on leave in January of 1917. The Ministry of Pensions awarded Sister Cattle a final award pension set at £60 a year for life. But by 1935, the cost of living had increased, and Sister Cattle had not been able to work since the mid-1920s. Again, she turned to the British Legion, and at their request, she penned a lengthy letter explaining what had happened after she demobilized in 1919. Her struggle with trying to run a nursing home and then a boarding house that she had to stop when she suffered a dreadful breakdown. She described what it was like living with her condition. Anyone suffering from neurasthenia will tell you it is impossible to get away from distress and mental confusion. But I did want to earn my own living, and being at home with my father, everything was made as easy as possible for me. But with it all, that 6-year struggle was one long nightmare. Okay, thank you very much. That's me done. I'll pass you back to Chris.
As we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, many of the nurses who cared for those sick with influenza at the end of the First World War were doing so at the end of a long succession of traumas, having cared for the war's wounded and suffered the privations of war service. This makes it difficult to analyse the extent to which it was the pandemic itself that caused their trauma, especially when, as Olivia has pointed out, their work in relation to the pandemic was so invisible in relation to the rest of their work. So I'll share with you another case study which relates exclusively to a nurse's work with influenza patients. Henrietta Taylor was a Scotswoman who referred to herself as a semi-trained nurse and who was serving in a French field hospital in Italy when the Spanish influenza pandemic began in 1918. And I'll read you something from her published diary, which just gives you an insight into some of the actual work the nurse. When I returned from leave, she wrote, I found my French ambulance in the little Italian town. The cases were coming in daily and the mortality was distressingly high. In the first 48 hours after my return, 12 men died. Every corner of the hospital was filled. In fact, my first job on the day of my arrival after 4 days' journey was to lay out a man in what had been my own bed. Nearly all the cases turned to a kind of septic pneumonia. It seemed indeed to be very much like what travellers describe as the pneumonic plague of China. And you can imagine why we chose this excerpt as one of the ones to share with you, with the references to the Italian hospital and this so-called pneumonic plague of China. Kind of gives you a feeling of plus ça change. We did all our work in eucalyptus masks and everything was disinfected, even our letters. One of the doctors died and 3 out of the 6 nurses had minor attacks of the disease. It was quite difficult to find time, even for the necessary amount of washing. The bed making and much else had perforce to be left to the Italian women and French infirmières. The untidiness of the wards, when we had time to think of it, was what my old nurse would have called a fair heartbreak. But indeed, there was so much else that was heartbreaking. Strong young men, poisoned through and through, burnt up with fever, fighting for their lives and passing through delirium and coma into the final collapse. All their lungs were affected and many had pleurisy as well. My days were passed in an endless round of putting on cold packs and giving PEEP and administering drugs and milk wherever possible. And I'll end this section of the presentation by telling you that Henrietta Taylor herself contracted influenza and pneumonia and spent several days in bed with a high fever, listening to the sounds of military funerals passing outside her window and wondering if she would soon die, and writing of how she'd made, quote, the one person I really trusted promised to tell me when that moment seemed imminent, whilst holding fast to her hand to combat the ghastly sensation of falling through the floor of the world. So our study is in a process of drawing out these resonances between the work of British nurses during the 1918-19 influenza pandemic and the practice of today's nurses. Enabling patients to breathe, giving oxygen, and preserving life until immune systems could kick in and eradicate the disease were the most important direct elements of nurses' work during the 1918-19 pandemic. And today's nurses are performing essentially the same work, but they are aided by technologies such as ventilation and continuous positive airway pressure, technologies that both support their work and add pressure and responsibility to their role. Their records indicate that the early 20th century nurses who cared for influenza patients in both civilian and military hospitals regarded themselves as having provided an essential national service. In many cases, they felt unable to request demobilization until the crisis was over. In analysing the significance of what Amanda in her research is finding, the phrase that is mentioned so often, stress and strain, in nurses serving during a national emergency and exhibiting characteristics of resilience, our primary sources indicated that nurses often presented an outward show of resilience long after their reserves of energy had expired. Recently, literature from psychology and from health sciences has been referring to the dark side of resilience and has suggested that there is a correlation between resilience and highly unfavourable outcomes, such as burnout, debility, and serious illness. And some of those First World War nurses and some of the doctors like that one you heard about who were caring for them could have told you that already. So nurses remain the icons of society, not only eliciting the now famous clap for the NHS movement, but also being held up as examples to encourage members of the public to give service to their nation. Their use in this way as exemplars of civic duty has inspired unprecedented levels of volunteering. When, in March 2020, the British government asked for people to work at community level, assisting the most vulnerable, the British people responded with over 400,000 volunteers in fewer than 24 hours. Children painted rainbows and put them in their windows as a sign of hope, and stated in those paintings that these were for the NHS. We argue that it was the primary example of nurses as emblems, of course, along with other healthcare workers, as emblems of resilience that encouraged the British people to display moral resilience. The price paid by those nurses in stark terms of lives lost has been prominent in the British mass media. But the more complex problem of physical and emotional damage requires closer scrutiny. It's become a truism for the British people during the Covid-19 pandemic that nurses are both heroic frontline carers and individuals at risk of trauma. The battlefield metaphor that places nurses in all settings, including hospitals, care homes, and the community, in an almost mythical role as both self-sacrificing angels and superheroes, is largely unhelpful to a profession which is working to secure the resources it needs to do its job, protect its workforce, and attain the recognition that comes with professional expertise. Nurses hold a dual role at time of national emergency, as life-saving professionals and collectively as a calming influence on society as a whole. They promote and enable engagement with public policies, ranging from compliance with lockdown measures, through support for vulnerable neighbours, to personal and collective resilience in the face of hardship and fear. Our project highlights the complexity of the task confronting nurses during a pandemic of a severe, life-threatening respiratory disease. Their work brings them close to patients whilst also drawing attention to them as icons of society. They struggle to fulfill their dual roles whilst also protecting themselves and gaining recognition for the significance and complexity of their work. Their manifest success during the current pandemic has helped to strengthen the social contract between society and its nursing profession, although it's not induced the British government to fully reward nurses for their vital work. It has provided lessons for this continuing and future pandemics. Our study provides evidence of the high toll their work with influenza patients took on the health and well-being of early 20th century nurses. In doing so, it highlights the need to pay close attention to the pressures faced by today's nurses in their work with COVID-19.